After months away from home, a war veteran returns with his loyal K-9 companion, carrying the fragile hope of hearing his daughter's laughter again. A little girl who has already known too much hardship. But what he sees shatters his heart. His disabled daughter is kneeling in the garden, trembling as she lifts handfuls of dirt to her mouth, while two wealthy men sit at a nearby table, laughing as if her suffering were their amusement. That single moment ignites a fire of truth and redemption, exposing the darkness that hides behind wealth and power. Join us in this story of love, courage, and the silent heroes who stand tall in the face of cruelty. If you believe every child deserves love and kindness, subscribe now so you never miss the stories that restore faith and compassion. May your day be filled with peace and light. The afternoon sun hung low over the hills of Maple Hollow, spreading a soft amber light across the quiet valley. It was one of those calm autumn days when the air felt gentle, the wind mild, and every sound carried far. Down the dirt road came a gray pickup truck, its wheels crunching the gravel rhythmically. Behind the wheel sat Jack Carter, a 42-year-old war veteran, tall, broad-shouldered, with calm gray-blue eyes that carried both weariness and quiet strength. The faint scar running along his jaw spoke of battles survived, but the warmth in his gaze softened everything. Beside him, Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and sharp amber eyes, sat upright, loyal, alert, steady. The two had survived battlefields together. Now they returned home, where peace, he hoped, still waited, and where the laughter of his little girl might heal the rest of him. As the truck pulled into the small gravel driveway, Jack smiled faintly. His house stood simple but neat, a white fence, a swing by the porch, and the faint rustle of the maple trees nearby. For months, that image had been his comfort on sleepless nights. He could almost picture Emily, 5 years old, small and bright, her metal prosthetic leg glinting as she balanced on her crutches, her laughter filling the air. But when he stepped out of the truck, there was no sound. The swing hung still, and the yard seemed untouched. "Emily," he called softly, voice hesitant, uncertain whether it was the wind or his own echo answering. No reply came, only the chirping of distant birds and the hollow creak of the gate. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. Dust hung in the sunlight streaming through the window. On the table, a cold cup of tea sat untouched. There were no toys on the floor, no sign of a child's presence. The air was too still, almost watchful. Jack's heart sank. He had entrusted Emily to Linda Foster, wife of Richard Foster, the wealthy man who lived across the meadow. Linda had always seemed kind enough, polite, controlled, with that careful tone of a woman who measured every word. But something about her eyes had always unsettled him. They smiled without warmth. Now, standing in the silence of his empty home, that memory clawed back at him. Rex paced near the back door, restless. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring. Then he let out a low growl, the kind that meant danger. Jack turned toward him. "What is it, boy?" But Rex didn't wait. He darted out the back across the yard toward the fence that separated Jack's modest property from the Fosters' sprawling estate. Jack followed, his instincts pulling him forward, a soldier's unease returning. The closer they got, the more wrong everything felt. The laughter reached him first, faint but sharp, the kind that carried arrogance. It came from beyond the fence near the Fosters' garden. Jack's pulse quickened as he approached the hedge and peered through. What he saw made the air vanish from his lungs. In the middle of the well-kept garden, Emily knelt in the dirt beside a mound of soil. Her small hands were shaking, her face pale, streaked with mud. She lifted a handful of dirt to her lips, trembling. At a nearby table sat Richard Foster, a man in his late 40s, lean, tanned, with slicked-back hair and a self-satisfied smile carved deep into his face. Next to him sat a portly man with silver hair and jeweled cufflinks, another of Richard's wealthy friends, laughing lazily between sips of wine. The table was laid with fine china and expensive food, a cruel contrast to the little girl in the dirt. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching with amusement. "If you finish that plate of dirt," he said, voice smooth with mockery, "I'll give you a real slice of cake." The words hung in the air like venom. His friend chuckled, a hollow, indulgent laugh that scraped against the quiet of the afternoon. Emily hesitated, tears filling her eyes, but still obeyed, scooping another handful to her mouth as if her humiliation were the only way to earn their mercy. Jack's vision blurred. For a moment his body froze, the kind of stillness that comes before violence. Then everything inside him erupted. He vaulted over the fence in one motion, boots hitting the ground hard. "Enough!" he roared, his voice shaking with rage. The two men jerked upright, startled. Rex bolted forward, barking furiously, every muscle coiled like a spring. Jack reached Emily and fell to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms. Her small body trembled uncontrollably. She looked up at him through tears, lips quivering. "Daddy," she whispered. Richard's smug expression twisted into a sneer. "You're trespassing, Carter," he said sharply, straightening his jacket. His tone was calm, almost taunting, as though control was still his. Jack's jaw clenched, his voice low and raw. "You made my daughter eat dirt." His words were not shouted, but heavy, dangerous. The other man stepped back nervously, glancing toward the mansion. Rex growled, circling, every bark echoing through the garden. The table shook as Jack slammed his hand against it, glass shattered, red wine spilling like blood onto the stones. From the terrace came a high, panicked scream. Linda Foster, in her mid-40s, thin, elegant, eyes wide with both fear and calculation, appeared at the stairs. For a brief second, she looked horrified. Then her expression hardened. "He's attacking my husband," she cried. Her words sliced through the air, shrill and desperate. Richard staggered back, clutching his wrist theatrically. "He's gone mad," he shouted, voice rising in false outrage. The noise drew attention fast. Somewhere, a neighbor must have heard, because soon the distant wail of sirens echoed through the hills. Emily clung to Jack, sobbing, "Daddy, don't let them take me." The plea tore through him, deeper than any wound he had ever carried. But when the police cars pulled up, blue and red lights flashing, he already knew the truth. No one would listen. Two officers ran through the gate, one older, heavyset, with the cold efficiency of a man who'd stopped questioning orders, the other younger, hesitant but obedient. Linda pointed toward Jack, voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "He broke in. He hit Richard." The older officer didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jack's arm, twisting it behind his back. The cold steel of the cuffs bit into his wrists. "You're making a mistake," Jack said hoarsely, eyes fixed on Emily. "She's not safe with them." Rex barked wildly, lunging at the officer restraining Jack, but another policeman caught his collar. The dog resisted, muscles straining, letting out a furious snarl that turned into a long, mournful howl. "No! Leave him!" Jack shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the chaos. Richard stood at a distance, breathing heavily, pretending pain while his friend looked on in silent disbelief. Emily reached out as Linda pulled her toward the house. "Daddy, help me!" she screamed, her prosthetic leg glinting under the fading light. Jack's chest heaved, his body tensed as if he could still break free, but the car door slammed shut, sealing him inside. Through the glass, he saw Rex's eyes, wide, wild, filled with sorrow, as the officers led the dog away. The sound that followed was unforgettable, a single aching howl that cut through the evening air, long after the police cars had disappeared down the road. The sun sank beyond the ridge, and Maple Hollow fell silent again. The Foster mansion loomed under the dim sky, its windows glowing faintly like cold eyes. In the wind, the old porch swing creaked softly, moving back and forth, the only thing left stirring in a world that had just turned cruel. Night settled heavily over Maple Hollow, the kind of night that seemed to muffle even the crickets. Inside the narrow concrete cell of the county jail, the air was thick with dust and silence. Jack Carter sat on the metal bench, elbows resting on his knees, his shirt stained with dried mud, the faint bruises on his wrists still marked by the steel of handcuffs. The dim light from the hallway flickered on and off, stretching his shadow across the cold floor. Every tick of the clock on the far wall hit him like a slow heartbeat, steady, unrelenting, counting each moment away from his daughter. When he closed his eyes, all he could see was Emily's face, her terrified eyes, her trembling hands clutching at his sleeve, her voice crying, "Daddy, help me!" It replayed over and over, a wound that refused to close. He barely noticed the sound of footsteps until a guard unlocked the door and motioned him out. A man waited at the desk, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in an old military jacket that still fit too well. Tom Reynolds, former sergeant and one of Jack's closest brothers in arms, now working as a legal investigator for veterans cases. "You're lucky I still have friends who answer my calls," Tom said quietly. The paperwork was already signed. Jack was being released on temporary bail pending review. "They can't hold you without charges longer than 48 hours, but Richard's influence runs deep here," Tom warned, his tone grim. "Tread carefully, brother. They're not done with you yet." Outside, the air was cold and damp, the streets empty except for the distant hum of a passing truck. Jack took a deep breath, the taste of freedom sharp and bitter. He didn't speak much. His gratitude lived in the firm nod he gave Tom before heading home on foot. The silence of Maple Hollow pressed around him, the faint glow of the Foster mansion visible even from across town. Every window in that house burned like an accusation. He clenched his fists. He had once trusted those people, and now his daughter's fear haunted the soil they walked on. The next morning he began quietly. No noise, no confrontations, just watching. Richard Foster's estate sat calm and perfect as always, its pristine garden concealing the cruelty it had witnessed. Rumors about Richard had circled for years, whispers of private parties with exclusive guests, of strange laughter behind closed doors, of a man whose wealth bought him silence. Jack started digging, not with weapons this time, but with questions. He spent days at the library, the courthouse, even the local cafe where workers gossiped freely when they thought no one important was listening. Slowly, a picture began to form. Richard Foster, philanthropist and socialite, had a darker reputation beneath the surface, a collector of innocence, as one former staff member had once said off record. A week later, Rex was released from the county animal center. The dog bolted through the gate the moment the latch clicked open, ignoring the handler's shout, running straight through the streets as if guided by instinct. Jack followed at a distance, heart pounding as Rex led him back toward the Foster mansion. The garden looked the same, clean, quiet, untouched. But Rex didn't stop. He moved straight to the far corner near the rose bushes, the same patch of ground where Emily had been forced to kneel. His nose pressed against the soil, claws digging furiously. The earth turned soft beneath his paws, scattering petals and dirt until something glimmered faintly in the sunlight. Jack knelt beside him, brushing away the soil. It was Emily's silver necklace, the small one with the heart-shaped charm he had given her on her 4th birthday. It was bent, nearly broken, as if twisted by force. Jack closed his eyes, his throat tightening. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a cry for help left behind. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. The necklace lay on the table beside him, catching the dim light of a single lamp. He turned it over in his hand, again and again. Each twist of metal felt like a reminder. Emily was somewhere in that house, and he had failed to protect her. But the thought that came next hardened his expression. This wasn't over. He would find proof. He would expose Richard Foster for what he truly was. 2 days later, a soft knock came at his door. When he opened it, Mrs. Clara Johnson, his elderly neighbor, stood there holding a tin of cornbread. She was in her 60s, a sturdy black woman with kind but knowing eyes, someone who had seen too much of the world to believe in coincidences. "I heard what they're saying about you, Jack," she began, her voice trembling with concern. "But I also heard what's been happening in that house." She sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "The maids who worked there, they're all gone now. Fired, one after another. The last one told me before she left that she'd tried to stop him once when he shouted at the little girl. She said Richard looked at her like she was next." Jack leaned forward, listening in silence. Clara's eyes glistened as she spoke, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know Sophie, the young woman who used to watch Emily sometimes? The sweet one with the brown hair? She hasn't been seen since the night you were arrested. People say she went to another town, but that's a lie. Her brother came looking for her 2 days ago." The words hung heavy between them. He sat back, the room suddenly smaller, the air heavier. "So it's true," Jack murmured. "It wasn't an accident, none of it." His mind moved quickly. The necklace, the missing girl, the silent staff. It wasn't random cruelty. It was a pattern, a system, a show for men like Richard and his circle. He clenched the bent charm in his hand until his knuckles turned white. Later that night, he stood by the window with Rex. lying at his feet, both staring at the darkness beyond the glass. The Foster mansion was visible again from afar, lit like a stage. "We'll find her," he said quietly. Rex lifted his head, ears pricking, as if he understood. The sound of the dog's slow, steady breathing filled the silence. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping through the empty garden. The roses swayed where Rex had dug, petals scattering like fallen memories. In the distance, thunder rolled, a low, gathering sound that hinted the calm was almost over. Jack knew this was no longer about one moment of cruelty. It was a chain of hidden sins buried beneath the soil and polished marble of that house. And now, with Rex beside him, he was ready to dig it all back up. The sun had not yet risen over Maple Hollow when Jack Carter started the engine of his old truck, Rex sitting in the passenger seat with eyes fixed on the horizon. The night had left a faint mist over the hills, and the air carried a chill that bit through the seams of his jacket. He had barely slept. The image of Emily's bent silver necklace still burned behind his eyes. The name Sophie echoed in his mind, the young caretaker who had vanished without a trace after the night of his arrest. Somewhere in the puzzle of lies surrounding Richard Foster, Sophie held the missing piece. Jack didn't know whether she was alive or dead, but he knew one thing. She had seen too much. The trail led north, past the forested ridge, and toward the lakeside town of Ravenhill, a quiet settlement about 30 miles away. The road curved along the water, glinting faintly under the morning light. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, while Rex sat upright, occasionally whining softly as if sensing the tension that never left his master's chest. Ravenhill was small, lined with motels, fishermen's cabins, and a few run-down boarding houses. Jack parked near one of them, the Willow Inn, its sign half broken and swaying in the wind. According to records Clara had found through her church network, Sophie had rented a room there 3 months ago under her real name, Sophie Miller, age 23. The manager, a thin woman in her 50s with nicotine-stained fingers, looked wary when Jack introduced himself. "You're looking for Sophie? Haven't seen her in weeks," she said, frowning. "Nice girl, kept to herself, paid on time. One night she just disappeared. Didn't even pick up her last paycheck." She handed him a key reluctantly. "Her room's upstairs. Been locked since." The hallway smelled of damp carpet and cheap air freshener. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by thin streams of light sneaking through half-drawn curtains. When Jack turned the key and pushed open the door, a stale stillness greeted him. The small room looked untouched, the bed neatly made, a stack of old magazines by the window, a duffel bag half-zipped on the chair. Rex sniffed the floor, circling slowly, then stopped near a wooden dresser. Jack followed the dog's gaze. He pulled open the drawers, clothes folded neatly, a few notebooks, an ID card, nothing unusual. But when Rex pawed at an old stuffed teddy bear sitting on the shelf, Jack's pulse quickened. The seams along its back looked recently stitched. He tore the thread open gently. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a small micro SD card. Jack's hands trembled as he slid the card into his phone. The screen lit up with a single video file, dated just days before his arrest. He pressed play. The shaky camera revealed a familiar scene, the Foster garden captured from behind the fence. The image wobbled as Sophie whispered in fear, "I have to show someone." Then the focus steadied. There was Emily, his Emily, kneeling in the dirt, trembling, surrounded by cruel laughter. Richard's voice echoed clearly, cruel and amused. "If you finish that plate of dirt, I'll give you a real slice of cake." Behind him, Linda stood silent, arms folded, eyes averted. The video ended abruptly when someone shouted off-screen. Jack's blood ran cold. His heart hammered so loudly he could barely breathe. He pressed play again, scrolling further. Another file appeared, one Sophie must have recorded later. The camera panned across a dimly lit basement filled with boxes, a tripod, and an array of toys scattered on the floor. Richard's voice again, slurred with drink and arrogance. "We'll call it the Little Show. People love a bit of tragedy dressed as charity." The screen shook as Sophie protested weakly. "They're children, Richard," he laughed. "That's what makes it so perfect." Then the camera turned abruptly. Richard's hand grabbing Sophie's wrist, his face twisted with anger. "You film what I tell you to, or you'll join them." The video cut out there, freezing on Sophie's terrified face. Jack lowered the phone slowly, staring into nothing. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Rex pressed his head against Jack's arm, sensing the storm rising within him. He exhaled shakily, whispering, "It's all here, buddy. All of it." His next move was clear. He couldn't go to the chief, not when Richard funded half the department. There was only one man he could trust, Ethan Ward, the young officer who had looked conflicted that night as the cuffs closed around Jack's wrists. The next afternoon, Jack met Ethan behind the old gas station on the edge of town. Ethan was in his late 20s, tall, with brown hair neatly cropped, his uniform pressed, the look of a man who still believed the law meant something. When Jack handed him the memory card, Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched. The color drained from his face. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The video played again. Richard's mocking voice, Emily's trembling form, Linda's silent complicity. Ethan stopped the playback. This is enough to destroy him." Jack shook his head. "It's enough to start something, but they'll bury it if we don't move fast." Ethan met his eyes, determination replacing shock. "I'll find a way. I promise you, Jack. I'll get justice for that little girl." That night, Rex couldn't sit still. He paced by the door, growling softly, then whining, then sniffing the wind as though catching a faint scent. Jack followed the dog outside, flashlight in hand. Rex trotted ahead, nose low, leading him through the trees behind the Foster property. The ground sloped downward toward an old storage shed, half hidden behind the garden's far wall. Its metal door hung crookedly, rusted at the hinges. The smell hit first, faint but unmistakable. Blood, old and dry. Rex scratched at the door until Jack forced it open. Inside, the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow space cluttered with broken furniture and torn cloth. But near the back wall lay something worse. Small toys, a cracked porcelain doll, a missing shoe, a camera tripod with dried stains across its legs. The faint outlines of children's handprints covered the dusty floorboards. Jack felt his knees weaken as the truth sank in. This was no storage shed. It was Richard's hidden studio, a chamber of humiliation disguised as play. He knelt, running a trembling hand over a stuffed rabbit, its ear torn. "She was here," he whispered, voice breaking. Rex whined softly, pressing his nose against Jack's shoulder. Jack stepped outside, gulping the cold air, eyes fixed on the mansion looming above. Behind those walls, men in fine suits laughed over wine while their sins rotted underground. He knew what came next would not be simple, but now there was proof, and proof was power. For the first time in weeks, something inside him steadied. The storm had a direction now. He looked down at Rex, who stared back with unspoken resolve. "We're not stopping," Jack murmured. The wind stirred the trees, carrying the faint scent of roses and rust. Somewhere in the dark, justice began to wake. The morning broke gray and cold over Maple Hollow. Clouds hung low above the town, as if pressing down on its silence. Jack Carter sat across from Ethan Ward in the dim office of the Maple Hollow Police Department, the faint hum of old fluorescent lights filling the air. On the desk between them lay the USB drive, a copy of Sophie's footage, and a printed still frame showing Richard Foster's face, twisted in laughter. Jack's jaw was tense, his knuckles white against the metal chair's edge. He had done his part. He had handed over the truth. But truth, he knew, didn't always bring justice. Ethan stared at the evidence for a long moment before speaking. "You realize what this means," he said quietly. "He funds the mayor's campaigns, the hospital, half the police equipment. They'll stall this." Jack's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "Then we don't give them time to." Word of the complaint spread quickly inside the station, but not the kind of way that led to progress. Behind glass walls and murmured conversations, Jack could feel the weight of hesitation. Some officers refused to look him in the eye. Others whispered Richard's name like it belonged to something untouchable. The chief himself, a broad man with a politician's smile, reviewed the files and said, "We'll need to verify before proceeding." It was a sentence that meant nothing. Ethan clenched his fists but said nothing in front of his superior. When they stepped outside, His frustration spilled out. "They're burying it, Jack. Just like you said." Jack only nodded once, calm in the way soldiers get when anger turns to resolve. "Then we dig it up ourselves." That night, Ethan arrived at Jack's home in plain clothes, his badge hidden under his jacket. Rain had begun to fall, thin and cold, streaking down the windows. "If we move quietly, we might find what they're hiding," he said, sliding a flashlight and a spare radio across the table. Jack didn't hesitate. Rex, already restless, paced near the door, his sharp amber eyes tracking every movement. They set out just after midnight, the truck headlights off, rolling through the mist toward the Fosters' estate. The mansion loomed in the fog like a monument to rot, elegant, silent, its windows dark. Ethan parked behind the line of pines near the property's rear entrance. They moved quickly through the wet grass, flashlights dimmed. Rex led the way, nose low to the ground, tail stiff. His ears twitched toward the garden, then toward the stone path that curved down to the back terrace. He stopped suddenly near a patch of overgrown ivy that clung to the side of the house, letting out a low growl. Beneath the vines, a metal door jutted out from the foundation, old, heavy, bolted shut. Ethan knelt beside it, pressing his ear to the surface. "There's something behind this," he murmured. Jack ran his fingers along the lock, industrial grade, recently replaced. Rex barked once, sharp and certain. The air that seeped from the cracks was sour, thick with the smell of rust, mold, and something chemical. "This is it," Jack whispered. He radioed Ethan's contact, 2 investigators from the next county who owed favors and didn't answer to the local chief. Within 30 minutes, a small unmarked van arrived. Tools clanged softly in the dark. They worked fast, cutting through the bolt, the sound masked by the rising wind. When the final hinge snapped, the door swung open with a groan, exhaling a stench that made every man recoil. Flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow staircase leading downward. The walls dripped with moisture, pipes rattled faintly above their heads. Rex refused to wait. He bounded ahead, barking furiously, claws scraping against the concrete steps. Jack followed, his boots echoing off the walls. The air grew colder, denser. When they reached the bottom, Ethan stopped short. Before them stretched a hidden basement chamber, wide and low-ceilinged, lit by a string of dead bulbs. Dust hung in the beams of their lights, revealing a grotesque display. Tripods lined against the wall, shelves stacked with videotapes labeled in neat handwriting, boxes of broken toys, and a camera still pointed toward a stained corner. Jack stepped closer. The walls were covered with pinned photographs, images of children, their faces streaked with tears, their bodies shaking as they were forced to kneel or eat dirt. Emily's picture was there, taped crookedly, her small hands clasped in fear. The sight tore through him like a blade. "My God," Ethan muttered, voice cracking. He filmed everything. The floor beneath the camera was littered with cracked porcelain dolls and tiny shoes. Rex whined, pacing near a dark stain on the concrete that glistened under the light. Jack knelt beside it, dried blood, months old. His hand trembled as he whispered, "Sophie was here." The investigation team moved quickly, documenting everything. One officer opened a cabinet and froze. Inside were several sealed envelopes filled with cash and a ledger listing payments and client names, politicians, businessmen, social figures. The reality was worse than anyone imagined. Richard Foster hadn't just humiliated children for pleasure. He had turned it into profit, selling footage to the wealthy who craved control over innocence. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of Rex's low growl filled the silence like a warning from something beyond words. Upstairs, the mansion lights flared on suddenly. Doors slammed. Linda Foster appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale, trembling. She had been beautiful once. Now she looked hollow, haunted by years of silence. "I told him it would come to this," she whispered, voice shaking. "He said if I ever spoke, he'd make me disappear like the others." Ethan approached slowly. "Mrs. Foster, you need to tell us everything." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded weakly. He filmed those children. He sold the tapes to men who called themselves patrons. I stayed quiet because I thought he'd stop, but he never did." Her voice cracked. "He said no one would believe me because he owned this town." Outside, engines roared. Police units from the county arrived, their sirens muted until the last moment. Officers stormed the house while Ethan escorted Linda out, her hands trembling as she clutched her robe. Jack stood in the yard, the night rain falling around him. The front door burst open, and Richard Foster was dragged out in handcuffs, his once slick composure gone. His hair hung wet over his forehead, his eyes wild. "You think this will change anything?" he snarled at Jack. "People like me built this town." Jack didn't answer. Rex barked sharply, the sound echoing across the estate, deep, fierce, final. The flash of cameras lit the driveway as news spread. Officers loaded boxes of tapes and documents into vans. For the first time in years, Maple Hollow's perfect image cracked. The laughter that had haunted its nights was replaced by the cold wail of justice finally arriving. Richard was pushed into the back of a police car, shouting, but no one listened. Rex stood at Jack's side, ears high, tail low, as if sensing the weight lifting from the air. The dog's final bark cut through the drizzle, a sound not of anger but release, a signal that the chains were finally broken. The courthouse of Maple Hollow stood quiet under a pale morning sky. Reporters had long since left, the crowd dispersed, and only the echo of the gavel remained in memory. Richard Foster, once the town's most powerful benefactor, had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. His crimes, the abuse of children and the distribution of obscene recordings, had shattered the illusion of Maple Hollow's gentility. Behind the courtroom glass, his face had remained strangely calm, the smirk gone, replaced by something hollow. Justice, slow but relentless, had caught up with him. Linda Foster, pale and trembling, had testified against her husband and was granted a suspended sentence for her cooperation. When she left the stand, she whispered, "I should have spoken sooner," though no one answered. Sophie Miller was found weeks later in a convent near the northern woods, living under another name. The small stone chapel was silent, except for the echo of choir voices through its arched halls. When Jack and Ethan Ward arrived, the young woman looked fragile, her once bright eyes dimmed by trauma but still carrying a glint of resolve. She spoke softly, hands trembling around a rosary. "I couldn't forget her," she said, meaning Emily. "Every night I heard her crying. I recorded everything because I knew one day someone would need to see." Her testimony in court sealed Richard's fate. Afterward, she returned to the convent, not to hide, but to heal, leaving behind the burden she had carried alone. The months that followed were a slow rebirth for Maple Hollow. The Foster mansion was seized by the state, stripped of its luxury, and left abandoned like a hollow shell of its past. Jack Carter and his daughter Emily, now 6, returned to their modest wooden house on the edge of town. The place was still quiet, the walls still scarred from years of struggle, but it felt alive again. The yard that had once been a place of pain was transformed. Jack dug up the old soil himself, removing every root and stone, and planted rows of sunflowers and lavender. "They're flowers that reach for the light," he told Emily, handing her a seed. She nodded seriously, pressing it into the ground with her small metal prosthetic leg glinting in the sun. "Then they're like us," she said simply. Days turned into weeks, and the garden began to bloom. Rex, the aging German shepherd who had once barked through gunfire and storms, now spent his afternoons lying between the rows of flowers, head resting on his paws. His fur had gone grayer around the muzzle, but his eyes were still alert, filled with the same quiet loyalty that had carried them through the darkest hours. On the wooden fence beside the porch hung Emily's silver necklace, polished and straightened, now mounted on a small plaque that read, "Courage grows here." Every visitor who came to the house stopped to read it, some leaving small notes or flowers beneath it. The story of Emily spread far beyond Maple Hollow. Local churches, schools, and even small news stations shared her story, not as tragedy, but as testament. Donations began arriving from people who wanted to help children like her. It was Ethan who first suggested turning that hope into something lasting. "We could build something in her name," he told Jack over coffee one evening. "Something that gives kids a second chance." From that conversation, the Emily's Hope Foundation was born, a small community fund dedicated to supporting children affected by abuse. Ethan handled the legal work, Clara Johnson rallied volunteers, and Jack offered the land behind his home for the foundation's garden. The day of the inauguration was bright and clear, the first true spring day Maple Hollow had seen in years. Families gathered in the newly planted field behind Jack's house, where a wooden sign carved with careful hands read, "Emily's Hope for every child who deserves the light." Ethan stood beside the podium, his uniform crisp, while Clara handed out yellow ribbons to the children. Sophie, now out of the convent for the day, sat quietly among the crowd, a faint smile on her lips. The smell of lavender mixed with the sound of laughter, a sound the town hadn't heard in too long. When it was time to speak, Emily stepped forward slowly, leaning on her crutch but standing tall. The microphone seemed almost too big for her, but her voice was clear, steady. "Once," she began, "someone made me eat dirt because they said I wasn't worth anything. But now, I plant flowers, so no one will ever have to feel that way again." The crowd fell silent, many wiping their eyes. Jack stood just behind her, his hands trembling slightly, pride and pain tangled in his chest. As the ceremony ended, Jack knelt beside Emily, pulling her into his arms. Rex barked once, then again, his voice deep and full, echoing across the hills. The sound carried over the rooftops, through the trees, and down the valley, a cry not of warning this time, but of freedom. Above them, the clouds broke open, and sunlight poured down over the garden, turning the fields of yellow and purple into a sea of light. For the first time in years, Maple Hollow seemed to breathe again. That evening, when the guests had gone, Jack sat on the porch with Rex at his feet, watching Emily chase butterflies between the flowers. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that looked softer now, no longer threatening. He looked down at Rex and whispered, "We did it, old friend." The dog wagged his tail once, eyes half closed, content. The smell of lavender drifted on the breeze, mingling with the distant hum of the town. For once, there was peace, not perfect, not permanent, but real. The garden stood as a quiet monument, not to pain, but to endurance. Every bloom was a story rewritten, every color a promise that darkness would never fully win. The soil that had once swallowed tears now nurtured life. And beneath the wide, forgiving sky, a father, a daughter, and a loyal dog found their way back to the light. In a world where cruelty often hides behind wealth and silence, this story reminds us that compassion is not weakness, it is strength in its purest form. True heroes are not always those who fight on battlefields, but those who rise quietly to protect the innocent, to heal what was broken, and to believe in goodness even when the world forgets it. Let this story awaken the kindness within us all. Share your thoughts in the comments, tell us how this story touched your heart, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories that restore faith in humanity. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace and mercy.